I guess we should maybe start with the title. You know?
Sure.
What does Doctor Sleep really mean?
How many of you guys have actually read the book? Okay, so you guys already know. So the title is referencing what Dan actually kind of becomes in his adulthood, especially in the later side of his recovery. Danny, since the events at the Overlook, has not used his shine. He's tried to bury it because of the danger that he thinks it put him and his family in when he was a kid. But he takes a job as an orderly at a hospice, and he finally starts to use the shining just a little bit to try to comfort patients in the moments before they die. He's able to understand that they're about to die. He sits with them and kind of helps them move on. It's actually a very lovely and very empathetic part of the book. And because of this, he's developed a nickname and a reputation around the hospice. The patients know that if he shows up in your room late at night, sitting by the bed, it's because it's over. It's because it's time to go to sleep. And so they call him Dr. Sleep, and that's his nickname in the hospice. What I thought was pretty great about it when I read the book was, as a lot of you guys probably know, his nickname as a child was Doc. And that was all from Bugs Bunny cartoons in The Shining. But I love that King was kind of able to make it so that the abbreviation that the patients would deal with him under was still Doc, that he kind of gave him a whole new context to that nickname. And I thought that was a really interesting way of recontextualizing how he was referred to as a kid. But that's where the title comes from.
So it's the story of Danny Torrance, but 40 years later, I believe, and he's still haunted by what we saw.
Oh yeah, not surprisingly, the events that kind of befell the Torrances at the Overlook scarred him pretty completely. And yes, he is also prone to the same alcoholism and temper that his father had. And the novel picks him up, kind of at rock bottom, in the throes of that addiction and trying to overcome it. And then kind of carries him through his recovery. I think in a lot of ways, The Shining is about alcoholism, and Dr. Sleep is actually about recovery. They go together pretty well that way.
So you have multiple source materials here you pull from, right? Can you tell us a bit about, I guess I'm sure some people are asking themselves, is this a sequel to King's novel? I mean, Kubrick's film? You're kind of balancing everything there.
I know, it's the most common question we've had since the project was announced, and the question we couldn't really answer, until we had material to present, because the answer is really complicated. The answer to all of those questions for us has always been yes. It is an adaptation of the novel Dr. Sleep, which is Stephen King's sequel to his novel The Shining. But this also exists very much in the same cinematic universe that Kubrick established in his adaptation of The Shining. And reconciling those three, at times very different sources has been kind of the most challenging and thrilling part of this creatively for us.
First and foremost, the movie's kind of its own thing, and has been embraced by all of our, by the Kubrick estate and by King kind of as such, but in a very real sense, we're standing on the shoulders of literary and cinematic giants.
Mm-hmm. Which has been, no pressure whatsoever.
I can only imagine. But at the same time, as a filmmaker, I mean, that must have been such an exciting challenge, right?
Oh my God, yeah. I, as a lot of you guys know, I am a Stephen King fanatic going back to my childhood. So any opportunity to work on, play in Stephen King's sandbox has always been a dream and an honor for me. But as a student of cinema, I idolized Stanley Kubrick. And I think the kind of storm of Stephen King and Stanley Kubrick on this for me has been the most exciting, delightful, intimidating, nightmarish, wonderful, incredible experience that I've ever had professionally. But it has come with more pressure than I don't want to say we didn't expect it. We knew what we were getting into, but yeah, it's been quite overwhelming in a wonderful way.
So how did you do it? I mean, how did you find that balance, the way you have to respect both King and Kubrick's vision?
Very, very carefully, and over a lot of trial and error initially when it came to trying to crack the adaptation. I went back to the book first, and the big conversation that we had to have was about whether or not we could still do a faithful adaptation of the novel as King had laid it out, while inhabiting the universe that Kubrick had created. And that was a conversation that we had to have with Stephen King to kick the whole thing off. And if that conversation hadn't gone the way it went, we wouldn't have done the film. As a lot of you know, I imagine all of you know, Stephen King's opinions about the Kubrick adaptation are famous and complicated. And complicated to the point that if you've read the book, you know that he actively and intentionally ignored kind of everything that Kubrick had changed about his novel, and kind of defiantly said, nope, this exists completely outside of the Kubrick universe. And so the first conversation we had to have, other than that we, as fans of King and apostles of The Shining, really needed to try to bring those worlds back together again. We had to go to King and explain how. And some of that, amounts to very practical questions about certain characters who are alive in the novel The Shining, who are not alive by the end of the film. How to deal with that, and then in particular how to kind of get into the vision of the Overlook that Kubrick had created. And our pitches to Stephen went over surprisingly well. And we came out of the conversation with not only his blessing to do what we ended up doing, but his encouragement. And I think the most nervous, this project has had for me the two most nerve-wracking moments of my entire career. And the first was sending the first draft of the script to Stephen King. And that was utterly terrifying, but he thankfully really loved it. And the second was at the end, very recently, of this post-production process, when the film was sent to Stephen to watch, and also to the Kubrick estate.
And how did that go?
Both went very well, and that was always the hope going in, was that if there was some universe in which Stephen King and the Stanley Kubrick estate could both love this movie, that is the dream. Threading that needle has been, the source of every ulcer we've had for the last 2 years.
Well, the other thing is they're both really supportive. I mean, from the Kubrick estate's point of view, they have such a long relationship with Warner Brothers, and they were generous with some of the original plans from the Overlook, which
you have to see his plans.
Yeah.
Annotated by Kubrick. It's so cool.
That was a good day. And then, King showing his support for, marrying, the cinematic tradition that he was maybe less a fan of with the literary tradition that he obviously wrote himself, was like, see, there's a lot of pressure. We really needed them to like it.
But I guess the star pointing is good because you're a fan of the movie and the books.
Oh yeah, and I think that, first and foremost, we're fans, and not just casual fans. This is one of the most influential pieces of cinema, in my life, and has been since I was a child, and same for Trevor. And when it comes to King's work, we're both kind of ferociously protective of him, because King adaptations can go, either way, and have, and so it's just as critical to us to protect him as a storyteller as much as we can if we're trusted with one of his stories. This more than anything, I think for both of us, was really a chance to live a fan's dream, and to try to protect the thing that we love, the things that we love, and try to bring them together. So it's been something.
But we already see that in the teaser, I have to tell you. Congratulations. We've seen some nods to The Shining in the teaser. I know you can't go a lot into detail, but can you share kind of how you decided to incorporate certain aspects of that film in your vision?
Oh, certainly. It's interesting too, because what you've seen today, in kind of the more iconic imagery that's been on the screen, that isn't taken from the Kubrick film. There's only one shot in the trailer you saw that's actually his footage, and it's the shot of the bloody elevators. Everything else is us. Everything else is our recreation. And so I don't want to spoil to what extent and what specific, outside of what you've already gotten to see, what we've kind of been able to to revisit from Kubrick's world. But I can say that everything that we decided to use, our attention was always to detail and reverence and making sure that we were doing it properly, with the hope that even kind of the most rabid, cinephiles might not be able to tell the difference with some of our frames and some of his. So that's always been the goal. And we were able to do that with the full support of the Kubrick estate, who were willing to provide us with his
they
designs.
granted us permission to use quite a few things, and but we always kind of approached them with a sense of balance, and and they were supportive of us making the movie that was, as I said, kind of its own thing.
And I think it is critical too, because I tend to go this way because I feel like it's the conversation I've been waiting to have for so long with everyone. But the more we talk about King and we talk about Kubrick and The Shining, absolutely that's a big and exciting part of this for us. But the story itself, though, and for those of you who have read the book, the story that we're telling primarily is its own thing, and it has everything to do with Dan and with Abra, and in the same way that Dan, the character, is kind of permanently influenced and altered by the events of The Shining, so is our movie to an extent, but the divide is also just as great. He's decades removed from those events, and so are we. So while it's definitely an element of the movie that we're making, the heart and soul of the movie and the reason we wanted to make it at all was really about this new story between Dan and Abra. And it's unavoidably, connected to that, but it is its own thing in a big way.
I think it's very important to say that this is a standalone movie.
Yes.
And that you're not copying Kubrick's style at all. That
would be impossible.
No, but you're executing your own vision here.
Yeah, and that's something too, as much as we talked about the balance between King and Kubrick, this also going into it, I said there's no way that I could ever dare to kind of stand up to direct comparison with Stanley Kubrick. It's ridiculous. At the end of the day, this is one of our movies. This is a Flanagan and Macy intrepid picture, and the priorities that we brought to it are the same we bring to all of our films. And while it definitely celebrates The Shining, I think in a wonderful way, this is our story, and it's Dan's story. That's the most important thing to us.
Well, speaking about Dan, which is a character we know from The Shining, though he was a little kid, the action takes place now, I believe, 40 years later. And where is Danny at the beginning of this movie? He's not in the best place, right?
Oh no. We pick up Dan in New Jersey, and in the throes of his alcoholism, kind of right at rock bottom is where we meet him. He's nomadic, he's violent, he's crawled so far into a bottle that there doesn't seem to be an easy way out. And it's really kind of a strange experience to meet your hero kind of at their most, their most awful version of themselves. It's a really, structurally, it's really fascinating, and from a writing point of view, to kind of be like, this is our hero, ladies and gentlemen, and you're going to meet him puking, in an alley, basically. So yeah, we pick up Dan at the lowest point of his life, and more than anything, this is a story about his redemption, and trying to avoid, repeating the same fate that his father had to deal with outside of the hotel, just with his own addiction.
And then we see how he finds himself, really, right?
Yeah, and he finds himself in a completely new role, which is basically to try to protect and mentor a child that was very much like he was when he was little, a little girl named Abra Stone, who shines as well, and even more so than he did as a kid. And he's kind of thrust into the role that Dick Halloran served in his life in The Shining, of someone who kind of very much by chance comes across this gifted child and has to try to guide them a little. And Halloran didn't have that much opportunity with Danny. They only met, the once. And in this case, Dan, who doesn't want to have anything to do with The Shining and with his own powers, is reluctantly kind of brought into a situation where he's going to be responsible for someone And that story, I think that's what really connected us to this. Someone who feels so broken in their own life, trying to fix themselves by taking care of someone else. We thought that was beautiful.
Watching the young, for those of you, this is not a spoiler for those of you who read the book, but watching young Abra embrace her powers in the same way that he's eschewed them his whole life, and she really draws him out and completes. He's living with the reverberations of these horribly traumatic childhood events that, in a sense, all the audience lived with him, and she is finally the catalyst to draw him out and cause him to deal with that. Which is why we're really lucky to have Ewan McGregor, by the way, because he makes that connection and that arc palpable and relatable.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to follow up with. You're making my job easy here. Casting is so important, any filmmaker will tell you that. And you have a great actor for quite a complex and rich role, right?
Oh yeah, and it was the end result of a pretty exhaustive search. Ewan, I think, just as a movie fan, Ewan brings with him decades of goodwill. For me as a viewer, I instinctively like and trust Ewan, which is so important, I think, with Dan, particularly because we meet him when he's so low. That could be alienating for a viewer. So you really need an actor like Ewan who can kind of wear his humanity on his sleeve. He also, as a bonus, turned out to be one of the nicest, kind of most humble men that you can imagine on a set, especially someone who's, basically cut off all the limbs of Darth Vader and, has had this kind of incredible pedigree of iconic roles. He's really incredibly down to earth and just a lovely person to have on set, so that is never a bad thing either.
How excited was he to get into a role like this?
Oh my God! Well, it doesn't hurt that he's a huge fan of The Shining, and we found that with kind of everybody as we started casting the nets out for actors. We found out that most of the people who were considering doing our film were rabid fans, so that was exciting too. But he dove in headfirst to this.
And then we have the character of Abra that we've seen in the teaser, the connection that's established between them. A new character, very important in this movie, who shines in a very special way, right?
Oh, indeed. And I think that's somebody you guys are probably, when you see the film, going to be talking about a lot. Kylie Curran is her name, and we looked at 900 girls to play Abra. Kylie, this is her first movie. She was a self-tape. It's that story you always hear in Hollywood that you never really believe, of all these very experienced actors coming out for a part, and it's this kid who's never really done anything who turns in the tape, who just rises all the way up to the top of the pile. And I think it's really exciting for us because we got to kind of see the birth of a movie star in her. She's a force of nature. She's so fantastic in this film. And I remember we were in prep. We had Ewan come down to read with kind of our top candidates, and a lot of them had done lots and lots of films. Some of them had done films with us before we were really pulling for. And Kylie came in, and the scene that they did for her audition with Ewan was the scene you see a piece of in the trailer on the bench where they talk about magic. And she just was Abra. It was one of those things that was so clear, so fast, and it was such a shock for someone who had so little experience to be able to do that. When she left the room, Ewan kind of looked at us, and we were all kind of shell-shocked by it, and he said, "It's clearly her, isn't it?" We said, "Yeah."
Yeah, and then you have that magic, which is called chemistry, which we never really know if it's going to work or not, but we can see it in the teaser.
They're wonderful together. The two of them together had a really very palpable connection, and it started immediately. It's really, and they're the heart of the movie. That relationship between the two of them is so critical that I think we lucked out in a huge way with her.
But then we have villains, don't we? And a pretty scary one too, played by Rebecca Ferguson, who's wonderful in this also.
Yes, and Rebecca, I can't wait to see the Comic-Con cosplay of Rebecca that'll come out of this, I hope. I thought when I read the book that Rose the Hat was probably the best antagonist that King had written in 20 years when the book was published. I loved that character so much, and that a really great villain is tough because you need to love, fear, and hate them all in the same breath. which is why I think it's so rare to do a great villain. And Rebecca Ferguson is Rose the Hat. I mean, she steals every minute of the film that she's in. I think it'll become kind of one of those iconic King villains. If you know her from the book, you know, she does her justice, and that character really leapt off the page. So I'm thrilled for you guys to see more of her on the screen.
Yeah, she finds the humanity in some very inhuman things that she does.
She does some horrible things. Horrible.
Well, on that note,
Which is like the coolest stuff.
I think I'm going to open for questions. Scott, back there.
Yeah, 40 years ago, if an audience would have a different threshold for what they thought was horrific or what was scary. And nowadays, if you showed a kid The First Shining, they might shrug their shoulders. So how did you raise the bar in that quotient? Because there's a different expectation level that people have towards horror.
Oh, certainly. And it's interesting because I've had that experience where I've shown someone The Shining and they don't see what the fuss is about. I think one of the solutions to that for us was we never approached this movie as a horror movie. You know, we always wanted to try to come at it from a different side. And we've done that with a lot of our things, but I don't know if it's ever been more true than with this one. It has horrific elements, absolutely. But one of the things that we were trying to be very careful to do is not to create the expectation that this is a modern horror movie in the way that people expect it. One of the questions that I would ask when we were developing the project and when we would talk about kind of the metered expectations audiences have about, in particular, jump scares and startles and the pacing of those, which we're utterly uninterested in this film. I would say, what's your favorite jump scare in The Shining? And there isn't one, you know. And the same is true here. You know, we used a lot of the lessons that Kubrick taught us about how to do a psychological thriller, a supernatural thriller, in a way that is more about suffocating atmosphere and tension than it ever is about the kind of traditional scares as we understand them today. And so in light of that, you know, we have been very careful not to make the kind of movie that those audiences would expect.
Just really quick, I mean,
yeah.
like for an audience, for example, a young audience, when they see that scene where Ewan McGregor sticks his head through the door that had been obviously, you know, the axe had cut through, may not get the reference.
That's very true.
Does it make a difference to who sees the film? That they're going to relate to it differently?
We've been pretty consistently surprised at even people who haven't seen The Shining, how much of the iconography they recognize. So obviously it's our job to make a compelling movie for an audience if they haven't seen The Shining, and you know we've been trying very hard to do that. But you know, The Shining's sort of infected, in a good way, culture in a very pervasive way, and we find it kind of showing through. You know, when we've shown the movie to kind of early audiences, we notice that a lot. So if you haven't seen it, it should still work, but
if you have it, enhances it.
yeah.
Although we've been prepared for the inevitability that we wanted the movie to still be really enjoyable to the viewer, who might, the only thing they might have to say about the Shining connection is, hey, look, they ripped off Ready Player One. Like, I'm pretty sure that viewer will be there. We wanted to make sure they'd enjoy it too.
Question over here.
Yeah. Okay. So, Mike, you're a massive horror nerd, and
Thank you.
have you're really good with detail. So I'm sure you're aware of all of the other legacy of Kubrick's Shining, from the TV miniseries to the many theories, like your shirt, that it's in some way hints that
Well
Kubrick faked the moon landings. Can we expect any sort of Easter eggs or meta-narratives or homages to the miniseries or anything like that?
Not to be overly spoilery, but at least one major announcement by NASA in the past year is something that I have faked. And this is my confession for that. So you have to let me know what you think it is. But yes, absolutely. You know, when it comes to the other Easter eggs that you can expect, and the other kind of influences inside and outside of the Kubrick film, I'll tell you, one of the most robust arguments we had was about whether the number on the door would be 237 or 217. Robust argument. And obviously,
And we went back and forth about 4 times in prep.
a lot. You know, I actually have quite a bit of admiration for the miniseries because of not only where they chose to shoot it at the Stanley, which is really meaningful just as far as the genesis of the novel, but for how they treated Jack. So what you'll see eventually, and I can't talk too much for spoilers again, but what you'll see is an honest attempt here to try to kind of pull all of that together. There are a lot of Easter eggs within the film, specific not only to Kubrick but to King as well, outside of The Shining and Dr. Sleep novels. So I'm hoping that this will be exciting for people as nerdy as me, and we did go out of our way to try to make sure that it would be. So
By the way, we had a bet on who would notice the shirt first.
Yes,
So well done.
and I'm unsurprised. I'm unsurprised that it was you. Yes.
It's the first thing I saw when you
I love that. That makes me happy. So yeah.
Well, if I may, I would like to ask a small cluster of 3 questions that are all related to the themes of the novel. I think the novel deals with the duality of death as a release, versus a violent, unwarranted death on the other side. Death as a release, of course, is shown through the scenes that you've mentioned with Dan Torrance as Dr. Sleep granting a release. My first question is, how important is this to the film? How much of those very moving scenes made into the movie? The other part of that equation is, there's a scene, I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about, where steam is gathered, and it is one of the most shocking scenes I've ever read. I don't think you can do this scene in modern cinema, so I'm wondering how you approached it. And last but not least, the third and important theme of this book, I think, is how to face childhood trauma and get on the road to recovery. And this is a personal question. Have you ever dealt with trauma or addiction? Did that influence your work?
Wow. Wonderful questions, by the way.
Hell of a cluster.
Yeah, it's a hell of a cluster. Starting with your first question, yes, the scenes of Dan as Dr. Sleep in the hospice, for me, are of critical importance to the film and to the character, and there's more than one. Which we can have a whole side conversation about the cat, which is a whole other thing that was really tough to pull off, but we gave it our best shot. The other side of that coin, the other scene that you're referring to, and how many people know what he's talking about with the steam being gathered? Okay. All I can say about that is I want to make sure that we adapt the book faithfully, and that we were never going to be PG-13 anyway. So, yeah, I'm curious to see what you think when you see what we did. But yeah, that scene on the page was one of the most horrific I'd ever read. It was the same in the script, and man, on set. But I'm excited to see what you think. And then finally, yes, trauma, especially reconciling childhood trauma, has been something that has been really important to me in my way into a lot of projects. It really was the heart and soul of Hill House for me. Going back to Oculus, I mean, it's something that means a lot. Addiction as well. I'm from a big Irish family who really liked to drink a lot. And I've not only seen, going back into my childhood, I've seen the damage that's done within my family. But I've fought with it myself. And at the moment, I haven't had a drink in 9 months, or a cigarette either, and the two are related. And for those of you that have been stuck with me on the smoke breaks, that took a while to finally get rid of. He's really thrilled about it.
Seriously.
Because man, on set, it's just like I'd be outside half the day.
There's a clause in our partnership agreement about secondhand smoke.
And yeah, and especially as I've had kids of my own, the importance of kind of separating both of those things from my life has really become paramount to me. I look at The Shining, the novel, which to me has always been the novel written by a man in the throes of an addiction, just meditating on the damage he thinks it could do to his family. And then I look at Dr. Sleep, and in the same way that The Shining is about addiction, Dr. Sleep is recovery. And I look at an author who is now decades sober, looking back at what his life was like when he wrote that book, and thinking about Tabitha and Joe and Owen and what his family could have gone through. And Dr. Sleep to me is so much of this redemption that I think King was trying to articulate that he'd accomplished. Those themes, which I think are complementary between the two sources, are some of the most affecting and important ones for me, and some of the things that really brought me to the project and made me excited about it. I think one of the interesting things that people talk about in respect to the miniseries versus the Kubrick film is how they handled alcoholism and addiction in particular, and how how blatant those themes were handled, to different degrees in both by both directors. And I think for us, it's really kind of freeing, because we are dealing with a completely the other side of that coin, and we're dealing with something that not only was so personal to King, but is personal to me as well. Thank you.
One other thing there, I think what's the special thing about Danny Torrance is that we all kind of lived through his trauma, those of us who have seen The Shining, and it's impossible generally to separate out deeply rooted fear from childhood. And one of the things we were very keen on exploring in the movie was, it's a very audience-oriented but character-forward way of kind of looking at a trauma we all witnessed.
When Stanley Kubrick was filming in Elstree Studios, when he was filming The Shining, the set was plagued by kind of strange goings on. I think one of the sets actually burnt down. A lot of publicity in the UK about that. Was there any kind of spooky, weird things happening on your set?
We didn't have anything quite like that. Our set was, the crew and the cast were kind of too busy riding the big wheel around and giggling for it to be too ominous for us. So no,
He's not kidding. We had an adult-sized
actually
big wheel that you could ride around the hotel.
It was the coolest thing. So yeah, we didn't really have anything like that. I think the scariest thing for us was making sure that we got the details correct. What we did have instead of the fire or anything like that was this wall of reference photos that we were agonizing over, because one of the other things, whether it's confessing faking the moon landing, or whether it was just because he was more interested in other aspects, you can't argue that Stanley Kubrick was terribly concerned with continuity in that film. And it, in places is part of his genius, and in other places, I think, having now gone and stepped into those shoes a few times, that it's like, oh wow, I understand this is really about getting the best shot. This is really about, finding a symmetrical frame. So yeah, that was kind of the overriding, frightening part for us. But yeah, we did not befall the same fate. We weren't there nearly as long either. He was there forever when they shot that, with a year and a half.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, in production. We were talking to, I'm Twitter friends with Danny Lloyd, who played Danny in the original, and we were talking about some of the stories that he remembers from that year and a half of his life on that set. And yeah, it sounds insane. It sounds just amazing. But ours was a little more jovial, I think.
If you want to work in genre filmmaking, though, it is actually scary that you shouldn't mess this up.
Yeah.
Well, Mike, Trevor, thank you so much. We've seen a taste of what's to come, and we're so excited. Thank you for being with us here.
Oh my
today.
God, thank you guys. And there's plenty more.
One more.
Yeah, was there
One more?
Yeah.
The last one. From Jack Nicholson to Ewan McGregor. When you casted Ewan McGregor, were you looking for somebody that had some kind of common thread with Jack Nicholson? And in case, which kind of common threads?
Well, we definitely wanted it to be someone who looked like he could actually be, the offspring of Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. More though, it was about making sure that we had someone who felt like Dan to us. I never really wanted to worry too much about making sure there was an element of Jack, because there really doesn't need to be in Dan. His last memory of his father, he was 5 years old, and Ewan can still arch the brows and throw a mean smile at you, like he can do it. But that was never really the point for us. It was really like, okay, does he look like he could be Danny Torrance? Then great, then that's plenty. We spent a little more time on some of the other characters that were already announced, that you guys, I'm sure, are well aware of. Alex Esso, who's playing Wendy. Alex definitely is in the same kind of physical places as Shelley Duvall. Like there is a resemblance there that's pretty interesting, but it's also still her own take on the character. So even though there's similarity, we were trying to also make sure that this never was going to be about imitation, that this really needed to kind of be its own expression.
And now we can't wait to see it. Well, thank you so much.
Thank
and
you, guys.
congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.